Hello everyone, StormyStrike here, and welcome to the video where we discuss what molds this year's BreyerFest 2023 Gambler's Choice Stagecoach Surprise Special Run will most likely be. First off, the usual disclaimer, I do not currently work for Breyer and I do not actually know what the Surprise Horse model is going to be. All my guesses and theories in this video are based on public information and patterns from past BreyerFests. I used a lot of information and photos in this video from identifyyourbreyer.com. Major props to that website and the people that are keeping it running. While the mold the surprise model ends up being on is usually in my top 10 list of mold guesses, I obviously can't guarantee that my guesses for the surprise model mold will be correct. This chart shows my current track record of where the surprise model mold for each year fell onto my list of guesses. And yes, this is the 9th time I've done a surprise horse speculation video, which is absolutely insane to think about. Before I review the different criteria I used to determine which molds could and could not be the surprise, I first need to share some very exciting and interesting information regarding how well the surprise mold will fit the name and theme of BreyerFest. On January 29th, the Mares in Black podcast released their episode number 97, which had the special guest of Kat McDermott on the show. Kat is a big part of the Breyer events team, which includes putting together BreyerFest. In the podcast episode, she revealed that at least as of late, she chooses not to know what the surprise horse is and names it without seeing the actual model. She does this so that the name doesn't give away anything about what the model or mold is going to be. This means that whatever the surprise horse mold is, it very well could not match the name of the surprise model name at all. And if it does happen to match the name of it very well, then that's just a coincidence. With this new information, I am now not going to take the name of the surprise model into consideration at all when picking out what I think the surprise model mold will be. Kat also said that in recent years, they have been trying to have the special run models relate to the theme of BreyerFest more these days than they have in the past. Looking back on past BreyerFests, there has always been some level of integration of models fitting the theme, but I think in recent years they've really been pushing for that even more, especially with the special run models anyway. They really try to have some kind of strong tie-in to the theme, even when they are using molds that aren't what one would normally think of for fitting that particular BreyerFest theme. That being said, I feel like the way Kat was talking about it and how the surprise horse molds in the past 5 years have fit the overall BreyerFest theme, I have a feeling that it is more likely that we will see the surprise model be on a mold that fits the BreyerFest theme over molds that don't fit the theme at all. The only problem is that this year the BreyerFest theme is about driving. Kind of like BreyerFest 2021 with horse of a different color. It means that pretty much any breed type is going to fit the theme, and it doesn't really lower the possibilities of different molds being used. Now that we covered that new, rather important information that Kat gave, it is time to give a refresh on all of the surprise model quote-unquote rules based on patterns from the past. The rules haven't changed much since last year. I've made some minor adjustments, but not too much, so if you're already super familiar with these rules, you can feel free to skip ahead to the next part if you wish. The surprise model will likely not be on a mold that's already been a surprise model, being used as a BreyerFest model this year, been used as a BreyerFest special run or store special last year, been a release recently within the past roughly 6 months before BreyerFest, a vintage or widely unpopular model. Vintage currently means any mold that was introduced prior to 2003, but for now I'm still going to consider some molds that came out in the 1990s. Additional points and rules to take into account. The surprise model mold often, but not always, coincides with the BreyerFest theme, is at least 3 years old, is a modern popular mold, but perhaps not too popular, has had a recent but not too recent release on the mold. This is roughly 6 months to 2 or 3 years ago. Is a traditional scale horse or large pony. No other scales, no very small molds, no foals, no other equines or animals. The surprise is often not the same breed type as the surprise model from the previous year. This is tricky for this year though, because last year's mold could be considered either a sport horse or a draft horse, as it's kind of a bit of both. So I'm not sure how much I'll be able to take this into consideration. There are a couple things I used to take into account that I no longer do, one of which is the live auction pattern, where the mold appeared in the BreyerFest live auction the year before, but the past few years this pattern hasn't been valid, so I no longer consider it. Secondly, as already mentioned, I will no longer take into account the name of the surprise model as a hint to what the mold is. Now, as I usually do with all these rules in mind, I went through all the traditional scale molds using identifyyourBreyer.com, and I crossed out all the molds that are highly unlikely in gray and next to impossible in red. Molds I think are possibilities I mark in green, and molds that I'm more on the fence on whether they are possible or not but can't really be crossed out, I leave with no marks. Also note that the molds marked in green don't necessarily mean I think they are strong possibilities, just that I decided to add them to my list of mold possibilities to then narrow down into my top 10 list of guesses. Alright, so let's begin. On the first screenshot here, I decided to add the Marwari to my initial list of possibilities. He's not one to jump out at you for fitting the theme, but I just couldn't quite rule him out and decided to throw him on there. The Marchador and the Foxtrotter I didn't mark out because they are just too unpopular, I think. Screenshot number 2, several possibilities marked out here, including the American Saddlebred, Andalusian Mare, the Arabian Mare, Mustang Mare, and National Show Horse. On to number 3, a continuation of the Arabian Mare mold variations, Ashquire, and Newsworthy, which I would doubt it would be newsworthy since we already have a jumping special run model. No, do not even get me started on this mold. It is extremely unlikely that the surprise model will be old-timer. I almost included a 4-paragraph rant in this video about why the surprise model will very likely not be old-timer. Please do not make me regret not including that rant in this video. In short, he is vintage and unpopular. It doesn't matter how much he fits the theme. Breyer would have a ton of angry customers if they made the surprise old-timer, and they know it. I find it funny actually that I haven't been seeing the same amount of push for the Pacer, for example, which is also a model that fits the theme, but is very unpopular in vintage, so that one also no. I'm sorry if you really want Old Timer to be the surprise, but I'm sorry, he's probably never going to be the surprise model. Not only is he a very old vintage mold now, but he is just not popular enough. Alright, let's get back on track here to number 4 screenshot. On here I just picked out Bluegrass Bandit. Peruvian Paso also made it. Number 5, I really don't think it's going to be Boomerang, but I did end up putting him on my initial mold possibilities list, which is why I have him marked out on green. Also on this page is the Hamilton mold. Number 6, I have the Cantering Warmblood, Tentatively Cigar, and Ruffian. Number 7, the Connemara Mare. I originally recorded and edited this video before BreyerFest began, which means before we found out that this year's volunteer model for both BreyerFest and BreyerFest is on the Connemara Mare mold, which is why she is still on this list of possibilities. She was even originally in my top 10 list, but I took her out and no longer think she is very possible for being the surprise model mold, since she is that volunteer model now. Number 7, Desatado and Salinero. Number 8, there is no model on this page even remotely a possibility. Number 9, there is Vermeer, Show Jumping Warmblood, Silver, and Smart Chick. Number 10, Geronimo, Goffert, and Duende. Number 11, Brishan, likely not the Laredo variation, but we'll talk about that later. The Standing Thoroughbred and Strapless. Number 12, Huckleberry Bay, and I almost did the Icelandic, but I don't know, popularity and size are stopping me on this one. Number 13, Kennebec Count, who I doubt due to his low popularity, but he does work theme-wise. Vallegro and the Walking Thoroughbred. Number 14, the Lipizan Mare, or however you pronounce that, I never know how to pronounce anything. I almost did the Welsh Mare, but I do think she is probably just too small. Then also on here is Wixom and Bobby Joe. Lastly, number 15, I almost put Zippo Pine Bar, but didn't. I also realized maybe I shouldn't have completely crossed out Marabella, because she does kind of fit the theme, but I think regardless, she is an older mold and just not popular enough. If I counted correctly, I ended up putting 33 molds on my initial list/chart here to help me with deciding which molds would go into the top 10. Taking into consideration all the different rules, mold popularity, and relation to the theme, it was not an easy list to narrow down, especially since there are still about 6 months to go till BreyerFest as of making this video, and in that time we could see several new releases that might help rule out certain molds. Depending on if there are many drastic changes to my list, I may do an updated video on my guesses right before BreyerFest. During my quest to decide and sort my list of top 10 mold possibilities, I decide to hunt and see if there is possibly any more patterns to the BreyerFest special runs that I haven't checked out before. And it turns out there maybe not, could be a pattern here. I'm not really sure, but I'm going to show you guys it anyway. What I did is I decided to look at all the BreyerFest special runs from the past several years, and came up with this when I listed out the years that each of the different special run model molds were released. This includes all the special runs for that year and the surprise model. The year that year's surprise model mold was made is highlighted in green. You'll notice that the mold year always falls sort of near the middle of the other special run mold years, but this really isn't new information. We've already known that the special run model won't be a super new or super old mold, but it is interesting to see it actually laid out visually like this. You can also more clearly see here the use of at least one very new mold in these special runs, and at least one very old mold for each year. I have noticed that there is a pattern of almost every BreyerFest having at least one special run mold from the 2010s and one from the 2000s, but that just kind of makes sense in how Breyer is using the more recent and popular molds. I did notice that in 2017 and so far this year that there aren't any molds from the 2000s. Could that mean that the special run model mold this year is more likely to be a mold from the 2000s? Maybe, maybe not, I don't know. Some of these patterns could very well, and probably are, just coincidences. Regardless, it is human nature to look for patterns, and I thought this information was just kind of interesting and I wanted to share it with you. Take this information as you will. Maybe you found a pattern in here that I missed. So when it came to narrowing down my guesses for the surprise model mold this year, I did end up doing a few honorable mentions along with my top 10. But before I get into that, I do want to mention some things that apply to all of, or a lot of, the molds on these upcoming lists. All the molds that made it onto my top 10 and honorable mentions, I believe, do fit the BreyerFest theme pretty well to some degree. Again, with a broad theme like this, a lot of molds could easily fit it and have some kind of argument for why they fit. But I do believe that every mold I picked works for the theme, some perhaps even more so than others. When picking out these molds, I was thinking about which poses look like they could be pulling a carriage or cart, etc., or what breed type is being represented that a lot of people would automatically think of as a driving horse. Secondly, there are several molds on this list that are technically vintage, at being 20 years old or a little older, but they were all made in the late 90s or later, and I believe are still modern and popular enough that I think it could be possible for them to be used. None of the ones I picked are like super old molds or ones that not many people collect. Lastly, I just want to tell you that this list was very, very difficult for me to sort and order the different molds on. I ordered and reordered it so many times before I was eventually like, okay, I need to stop moving everything around constantly and just leave this list alone so I can actually get this video made. Otherwise, I could be shuffling this list of mold guesses around several times every day until BreyerFest. It is just so difficult because there are many different factors and ways I could look at these molds to determine how likely I believe they are to be used as the surprise model this year. Now let's go on to the actual list, starting with my honorable mentions. I ended up picking 3 honorable mentions this year. The first honorable mention is Wixom. She is a big draft horse that definitely fits the driving theme, but she is considered vintage now at 22 years old, and I do question if she is too big and not quite popular enough these days. And I mean too big in the sense that I would expect Breyer to raise the price of the surprise model a little if they used her. She is a big girl that requires a lot of plastic, although I suppose the Cleveland Bay is also a pretty big model and also requires quite a bit of plastic, and they used him last year, so who knows. The next honorable mention is Ruffian. While her mold age and popularity are right to be a possibility for the surprise, her pose and breed type is a little questionable by being a warm blood and by being in a full-out racing gallop. Is it possible for a horse to be galloping while pulling some kind of wagon or something? Yeah, sure, but it's not very common. And the fact that this is such a big stretched out gallop, if it was a more collected gallop, then maybe she'd be more likely. The last honorable mention is Carrick, or the Walking Thoroughbred. He is much like the Ruffian mold in that when it comes to age and popularity, he works, but not so much for breed type. Unlike Ruffian, his walking pose is more feasible for a driving horse, however. Now on to the actual top 10 list. Number 10, Bluegrass Bandit. Maybe not what you'd think of right away for the driving theme, but she does look like she could be a nice little pleasure carriage horse out on a leisurely drive. She also doesn't really have anything that would make her questionable in regards to age and recent releases. I also think she is pretty popular without being too popular. And I know I've had this girl on my list of surprise horse guesses for ever, it feels like. But I do think she could just make a very nice surprise model someday. Number 9. National Show Horse, or Rejoice. Unfortunately, this girl is getting up there in age at 25 years now. She is so fitting for the theme, though, that I couldn't help but put her on this list. This mold was even used as a celebration horse for BreyerFest in 2010 to represent All Glory, a saddlebred that did do driving. I do question this mold's popularity, however, which is why she ended up on the lower end of the list. By the way, I should mention this mold is not the same mold that is being used as the Crystal model this year, and the Hamilton mold isn't the same mold as that Crystal model either, so that Crystal model really does not affect this mold being used, unless you want to argue that the pose is too similar. Number 8. Show Jumper, or Show Jumping Warm Blood. This boy is just now considered vintage this year, but he seems pretty well liked and popular overall still. He does have different mane and tail combinations that could be used. As some people have already mentioned, and that I noticed as well, he was used in the WEG Breyer combined driving display back in 2010, which kind of shows that yes, he could fit the driving theme. Number 7. Strapless. I originally had this mold much higher on my list of guesses, but I decided to put her lower due to the fact that she is 20 years old now, and she is in a very similar trotting pose to the Cleveland Bay last year. I don't know if that is something that's considered at all when picking the surprise mold, but I have noticed that it seems like the surprise model mold is usually in a pose that's a little bit different overall from the one of the previous year. This doesn't mean I'd rule out any molds that are trotting completely, but if you compare Strapless and Cleveland Bay, they got a similar trot movement going on that maybe makes them a little too similar to be used one after the other. Aside from that, however, I do think this mold is nice for the theme. She has the fun bonus of different mane and tail options, and she has a nice level of popularity. Number 6. Racking Saddlebred Stallion, or Hamilton. There is no doubt that this mold is popular, but it does wager the question of if he is too popular right now to be the surprise model. Dundee also seemed pretty popular to me in 2021 though, so I don't know. Could Hamilton be too popular to be used right now, or does Breyer not mind using a super popular mold as the surprise model? Who knows? This mold does work breed-wise for the theme very well, but apparently he doesn't work as well pose-wise. The rack gait is apparently not done when driving, according to people that know more about it than I do. I really don't know enough about different horse gaits in the world of show driving to know that, but that's what I've heard. Hamilton is still a pretty new mold at only 4 years, although he's technically not too new since Dundee was used and at that time he was only 3 years old. Based on previous years though, it does seem more likely for an older mold to be used over a very new one, which is why I'm hesitant to put him up further on this list. Now for my top 5 guesses. Number 5. Frisian Sport Horse, or Vermeer. This model's place on this list could easily be switched around with Hamilton, as he has the same slight issue of being very new. He is even younger at only 3 years old, which again doesn't rule him out, that he is still a pretty new mold, and perhaps makes him less likely to be used compared to others. This mold does, however, fit the theme very nicely. He is a popular mold, but perhaps not quite as popular as Hamilton. To throw in my own personal thoughts real quick, out of all the molds on this list, this one is probably my favorite out of all of them, and therefore I both hope and don't hope that he's the surprise model, as I'm probably going to want most, if not all, the color variations that he comes out on if he is the surprise model. Number 4. American Saddlebred Stallion. I feel like this mold is such a good fit for the theme, and a mold that Breyer seems to like using quite a bit over the years. He does have the problem, though, of being a 23-year-old mold now. If he was not that old, he would likely have been my number 1 or number 2 guess on this list, as I really do think he is just so fitting for the theme, and he seems like the kind of mold that Breyer would pick to be the surprise. But alas, he may never be one at his age. Number 3. Brishan. This mold is no stranger to my surprise horse list of guesses. This mold, yet again, fits everything when it comes to things like age and popularity. He's in the right age range at 11 years right now. He's popular, but not overly popular. He has different mane and tail combinations, and even a different body type, but I doubt that would be used based on the BreyerFest theme. If they use just the Irish Cob version, then this mold's breed type does fit the theme very well. The only possible issue is that the stablemate version of this mold is being used as an event stablemate model this year. Clearly, since this mold is so high up on my list, I don't think that is something that rules it out from being used. Stablemate versions of molds haven't really been around long enough to really be able to determine if their use in that same BreyerFest year rules out the traditional scale version of that mold also being used. Number 2. Cantering Warmblood or True North. I am really surprised that I ended up putting this mold so high on this list, for while this mold does fit the theme, I feel like it doesn't fit the theme as well as a lot of other molds on this list. So you're probably wondering then, how did it end up in the number 2 spot? Once again, a lot of it has to do with age and popularity. This mold is 6 years old and is very popular, but not extremely popular, I'd say. Even though I don't find the breed type to immediately come to mind as a driving horse, the pose does feel like it could work really well in a driving scene. I do still question whether or not a warmblood type horse like this would be used because of last year's surprise model being a sort of warmblood draft horse, but I think if they were to use one or the other again, I think they'd pick warmblood over draft. That's just my own speculation. On to my number 1 mold guess for the surprise model. Number 1. Goffert. This was really tough to decide on, but it all came down to me choosing a model which I felt best fit all the different aspects and factors that I've been talking about. Goffert is 17 years old, so he is getting up there in age, but the Cleveland Bay last year was 16 years at the time it was being used, so he's still in that right age range, I'd say. This is a popular mold, perhaps not quite as popular as he used to be, but I think he falls into a similar level of popularity like the Cleveland Bay and Giselle. His breed type and pose feel like they could very easily fit in with the theme. I know I mentioned earlier that I didn't put Strapless up higher because she was in a trotting pose like the Cleveland Bay. Yes, Goffert is also in a trotting pose, but I feel like the pose and overall look is different enough from the Cleveland Bay, and the fact that Goffert actually has to have a stand because his trot is like lifting him off the ground practically. I just think that it is different enough. This mold feels like one that I could very easily see Breyer using as a surprise model. He's shown up in my list of guesses in the past before, several times now I believe. Prior to last year's surprise model, I would have said that Goffert hasn't had a recent enough release to be used, as the last time this mold was used was in 2020 as Crystalline. However, the Cleveland Bay was used last year, and his prior release was the Celebration Horse in 2019, which is also a 3-year difference. So while before I more seriously considered molds that had a 2 years release at the latest, I think it's safe to now extend that to 3 years. Lastly, about this mold, there is one reason I almost didn't put him as my number 1 guess, And that's because he is a fluffy Frisian / Irish cob type horse. And looking at the lineup of the BreyerFest models this year so far, there are quite a few models of that similar sort of breed type. I did wonder if there were too many of those types of models for him or other molds like Bershon or Vermeer to be used. But this also could just mean that Breyer really likes using that breed type this year, and maybe they're even more likely to use a mold like this. Who knows? There is my top 10 list of guesses. At the end of the day, it is all educated guessing, and this year was very hard for me because, as you might have noticed, I can find a reason why pretty much all of the molds on this list here could not be considered for being the surprise model for one reason or another. And really, I am not exaggerating when I say I shuffled and reshuffled around models on this list like at least a dozen times. I am seriously having to force myself not to shuffle things around again right now. All that being said, I am really curious to hear what your guesses for the surprise horse mold is. You can let me know in the comments what you think it will be, and if you want, you can also add why you think it will be the surprise. Don't go just yet though, as lastly for this video, I want to talk about the surprise horse variations in regards to color and finish. Last year it was interesting in that there were 6 total color variations, but the solid colored model only came in gloss, and the decorator only came in matte. It's actually not too unusual for a decorator variation of the surprise to only come in one finish, but it was surprising for one of the realistic colored models. So that is an interesting change that Breyer could very well throw in again this year. We can probably expect though that at least half of the variations will have a glossy and matte split. There will likely be 4 to 6 different color variations. With the sheer number of surprise models that have been produced these days, I'd say it's maybe more likely that we see 5 or 6 colors. The last time there were only 4 colors was in 2020, but the surprise model back then only had 4,500 made in total. This year there are 7,700 made. It is of course still possible that they'd only do 4 color variations, but I think it is much more likely that they'll be doing 5 or 6. As usual, we can probably expect there to be a solid colored variation, a Pinto, and an Appaloosa. That's generally pretty consistent for most of the surprise models. A decorator is also highly possible, but not always the case. There have been several years where there isn't a decorator model. I'd say for this year I could see it going either way on whether or not there will be a decorator. I think most likely if we get a deco, it would be of a more generic decorator color, kind of like what we got last year with the Wedgwood Pinto, or perhaps a clearwear model. Personally, I do hope we see another clearwear surprise model, since I now really like clearwear models. The last time there was a clearwear surprise was in 2019, which was like 4 years ago now. Oh my gosh. So who knows? Maybe we'll get one this year. As for what colors I think the other realistic variations of the surprise will be, I honestly have no idea. At this point, my brain is kind of fried on guessing, and aside from the general patterns I already mentioned, it's really hard to say, as they could really do any kind of combination of realistic colors and patterns. That's it for talking about the surprise model. Don't forget to let me know what your guesses for the surprise model is in the comments. Feel free to add any thoughts about what colors you think it will be too if you have them. If you're not subscribed already, consider doing so you don't miss out on my other BreyerFest and model horse related videos. Thank you for watching, have an awesome day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye everyone!